first must say is I am staggered by the international nature of this audience. Is there a European country not represented? This feels like quite a special group here this morning. Yes, so culture and self-management. So like Sarah mentioned, please fire in your questions into the chat as this rumbles along. We'll try and crowdsource as many questions as we can. But yeah, to kick off, Tom, we've got this question of culture and self-management. And as difficult as this may be, could you have a go at outlining what you think are the salient aspects of Viisi's culture as pertains to self-management, right? What the salient aspects of the Viisi culture and how this has helped Viisi over the course of the pandemic. So if you could kick off giving us a sketch along those lines, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Nice that so many people attend this talk or our conversation. Looking forward to a lot of questions. Sometimes I would like to refer to also to books, etc. So if people feel inspired, that they can dive a little bit deeper, because it's not about Viisi, our company, and it's also not about me. To answer your question, Richard, I would like immediately to frame this in the book. A lot of people know Drive of Daniel Pink, because I think we're not an exception. Most people like, and these are the three pillars of this very famous video of the RSA about the Drive book. It's about autonomy. People want to decide for themselves how they do the work. It's about mastery. People want to become better. Like, for instance, at the moment, you want to become a better soccer player, football player, because it's nicer when you can play much better. And it's also about a sense of purpose, which is something which in the pandemic, I think a lot of people realized much more than they did before, on a lot of different levels. So if this is in place, and I think the crisis has worked as a kind of, yeah, how will I call this? It makes things clearer. So on the one hand, you have companies who want to go back to command and control, and on the other hand, companies are pretty relaxed and say, we're doing fine. We did fine during the pandemic. The trust, which is the core of the whole culture, proved that we have a very focused culture in a sense that people feel responsible, and so we were doing very fine. But I think, let's say, a lot of companies where values and trust is in place, they all did fine. That's at least what I hear. And I'm not talking about restaurants with a lot of problems, but just in general, my impression is that we're not an exception. All those, for instance, IT companies where there's a lot of trust, those companies did very well. And everybody tells after the pandemic, whatever you like, you can go into the office or you can work from home. We don't care. We are doing fine as a company.
Right, thank you. Yeah, and so I'm hearing these three pillars: autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and that underpinned, it sounds like, by trust, and then people have a sense of responsibility. I wonder if we take each of those in turn then. So what is it that Viisi does that empowers or enables people to have more autonomy in their roles?
Yeah, I think what I often see is, and I really have to start with a kind of disclaimer. It's very complicated because it's a very, very big puzzle, and it consists of a lot of pieces. So you can't just take one part out of it and say, okay, when I implement this, then everything will be solved and everyone will act self-responsible. That's not the way it works. So, but I think the basic starting point is this theory of, do you trust your people or do you distrust your people? Do you feel that you have to control them, and you have this spy software on computers and this crap, which I find also from a let's say data point of view incredible. that we have this kind of discussion. It feels like a little bit 1984, or not a little bit. It feels like 1984. So it starts with trust, and then I would say, just to frame or take another book which we also discussed, Amy Edmondson and Psychological Safety. If you are able as a starting point to create that people feel safe, then everything will work out in the end, to put it in a very simple way. And how do you create psychological safety? That has to do with the way you're organized, and what we just said. Are people able to discuss themselves in the team, who to hire, how to do the work? But it also has to do with salaries. It has to do with the kind of culture you have. Are you long-term focused, or do you have a very short-term culture which is based on hire and fire, and so on and so on and so on.
Right. And okay, so there's plenty of aspects to talk about there. I wonder if we should to paint the picture here a little bit, go back to the start of Viisi. So maybe that's a better place to start. Like, when you first founded it, and you founded it with your co-partners, what did you put in place right from the start, right? So we talk about complex systems, we talk about the importance of initial conditions, right? All organizations are complex systems. What were the things that you determined to do right from the start when you founded the company?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First, I have to say that we were not the founders people think, which is the normal case, that we were 25 and decided to let's say on a Friday evening in the pub to start a company. So and that's also what statistics don't tell us. So the most successful companies and the most stable companies are founded by people who are average is 44. I was actually also we also in this age bracket, and those people who start companies or successful companies, they have worked for quite a long time in just very normal companies, like we also did. And then you have two possibilities. You can just quit because you don't like the corporate environment anymore, or you have a certain opinion on, let's say, if people should go take a kind of innovation or develop a new product, etc. Or, and that was our case, we just lost our jobs. So it was a very simple situation. We were working for a German company, a stock listed company, and they closed down subsidiaries in the Netherlands and in Switzerland. And we just said, okay, what are we going to do now? Shall we apply somewhere and search for a job? And we were just very lucky 10 years ago, because the company exists for 10 years now, that at that time nobody had children. So we were 4 people. We didn't have children. And we said, okay, just give it a try. Shall we just continue? And I think a lot of people are in this situation. So it has to be a kind of situation where you still have enough experience to have a kind of understanding or sense in which direction there is an opportunity, or perhaps you have some clients. And then actually, to answer your question very precisely, we just said the main driver to start our company is that we want to do the things we think we like to do them. This whole idea of autonomy, and I think it's not about earning a lot of money. So this whole idea of all those unicorns and becoming very rich and start a company and exit it as fast as possible, etc. That's not the main driver to start companies. It's autonomy. And then the question is, if you like to start something because you want to decide for your own, why would you, if the company becomes bigger, tell other people what they have to do all the time and micromanagement them? So that, I think, is the main thing. So I always would like to just reframe or to focus on this and say, okay, if you build your company, please reflect on the reason you founded the company and treat others like you wanted to be treated yourself, or think why you started the company.
Right. Right, and I guess as you say that, it has me reflect on the hypocrisy, as you say, of some of these founders. Is they start it because they want to leave the machine and strike out on their own and do their own thing and have all this autonomy, and then over time they create these bureaucracies that stifle the autonomy of everyone who works with them. I think that's interesting. But was that a tension amongst the four of you? Were you all on board and sort of had the same aspiration in terms of level of autonomy, or were you kind of constantly managing a tension between you as you started to build the culture?
Also, we are totally different people, so we have very complementary skill set, so to say, and then you have often, and that's often the case in those teams, you have people who more from a kind of intuition starting point, feel doesn't feel right, or I don't want to tell people in a kind of detail what they have to do. And then on the other hand, you have, and that's probably more my, let's say, personality, by reading books permanently and reflecting on this, looking for research, etc. But that's also, for instance, if you talk about psychological safety, it's all based on research. And it doesn't matter what kind of topic you want to solve as an entrepreneur, you always find an enormous amount of research. So just to put it very simple, these pillars of drive, there's just a lot of research done on that. So if you create a kind of system where you have autonomy, mastery, and a sense of purpose, you will just build a better company. So why wouldn't you do so? Or if you are more long-term oriented, you will be more profitable. You will have a higher, let's say, shareholder value. And it's the same with self-management. So just to take another book, if you take this whole development of self-organization, the interesting thing is that everything which is really, let's say, big as a structure or complicated, all those systems are self-organizing systems. So if you talk about ecosystems, which I always find very interesting, that even in our language, in our business language, we use words which are taken from other disciplines. So ecosystem is something which you take from biology. And in an ecosystem, we know that it's self-organizing. So a rainforest or a biological ecosystem is self-organizing. There's not a kind of dictator who tells which animal what to eat or something like that. It's all self-organizing.
Right, right. So you were inspired by a lot of this reading. Some of your co-founders were more intuitive, but I'm just interested in how the culture started to emerge. So what were like the first concrete decisions that you made that were perhaps consciously different from the organizations you'd been from? Like, was it the first hire you had to make, or did you immediately start going public with your salaries? Like, what were the first steps that sort of indicated the manifestation of this type of culture?
Oh, there were a few different topics. So on the one hand, like Sarah just said, we're for the third time in a row number one, but it's the fifth year we're taking part in this Great Place to Work, let's say, ranking. So there was this understanding that if you want to build a great company, you have to kind of reflect on if people are happy working in that company. So I always would tell people, okay, start with this idea of asking your people if they are happy very early, because then you find out what you have to change all the time or what you have to implement. That's one thing, and that's a kind of automatic. There's an automatic systemic approach to that, because this kind of audit comes back every year, and so that really helps you. Then you just have a kind of, depending on how many founders you are, where let's say if you split up the work, then you have very soon a situation where people tell each other, if they were sitting just on a kitchen table, better you take this topic and I take that. I mean, if you would found a company yourself, then you also would think about who I'm going to hire, what do I don't like, or let's try to hire other people. And then at a certain point, it's the third thing, at a certain point, people don't fit around this kitchen table anymore. and then you have to think, okay, what's the next step? And there are those different phases in let's say growing companies, and it's often called valley of death, that every situation or every growth path has its challenges. And then at a certain point you have to think about what will be the structure of the company. Will we create a vertical structure? Let's say the old idea of the orange structure in La Lou's reinventing organization of a kind of army, and shall we just put on our shirt who has which rank, and I'm the general of the army, so to say, or shall we have a more horizontal approach, and then connecting these kind of things and discussing it with each other? Then we just said to each other, shall we just try holacracy, or this combination of holacracy or sociocracy? And that's perhaps also something for people who start companies or trying to experiment. The earlier you start, also referring to the poll we just did, the earlier you start and the younger the people are, the easier it will be. So you have a kind of metrics, let's say working experience and size of the company, and the younger the people are and the smaller the company is, it's easier to start. And the bigger the company is, and if you have a company of 100,000 people and the average, let's say, working experience is 25 years, that will be a hell of a challenge, so to say.
Right. So you were all quite experienced, but you managed to overcome that, because it was a young company and you were in at the start and you could change the culture. Let's have a look. We've got our first question here. Interestingly, I now run a family business. When changing culture, which has been embedded for over 30 years, is challenging. Do you have any recommendations on how to manage this process when you take over to enable these challenges? So taking on a 30-year-old family business. Yeah, any thoughts on changing culture there?
Yeah, I would, if I may answer that. I think it's excellent when it's an excellent starting point, because one of the positive sides of a family business is that it's very long-term oriented, and that's something which is extremely important for any strategic decision you take. So I would say start with purpose. What's the reason for being? What's the reason for your business? Start with the cause. There's also a sense of purpose in this drive book, if you want to start in a very simple way, and then discuss about the ranking of your shareholders, of your stakeholders. And for instance, on our website, it just very put transparently, and it starts with the purpose. So we say purpose is the CEO of the company. Then people first. So our own people, we are more important than the client, so to say, just to put it a little bit provocatively. If people are happy, then clients come second, and then shareholder comes last. So we say if the people are happy, then the clients will be happy, and then the shareholders will be happy. And that's, I think, a very, very simple model, which fits very well to a family owned company. So I would just say give it a try and just start with it.
Yeah, and my own experience of working, with long-standing cultures, that nature of that inquiry, right? You're putting people into a much more open space, right? And from there, it becomes much easier to tackle these questions of culture. Yeah. So the next question here. In Viisi, how do you drive people so that they feel responsible for the results of their work, in particular financial ones? And what if objectives are not reached and the survival of the company is at stake? So how do you drive people to feel responsible?
You don't have to drive people to feel responsible. People feel responsible. So, and that's why I always would recommend go into this research, dive into this research. People feel responsible. And and it's the same, like bonuses are counterproductive. So it and sometimes we think it's counterintuitive, but it's not. So the example I always take about the pandemic, it even goes beyond. When this lockdown was there in March last year, for instance, in Europe or in certain European countries, you saw those pieces of paper on in apartment buildings, etc. Just if need anybody help, please dial this phone number. So people have this collective responsibility. You don't have to tell them that, but you have to. But you can't motivate them. You have to take away demotivation.
Yeah.
And the problem is that our way of seeing the world, especially if you're much younger than I am, I'm 53, you're raised in a kind of belief or cultural setting, which means that the carrot and stick approach is the best model. But research has proven that it's the worst model. But if you are told all the time by media and management literature that shareholder value maximization, despite of any other interest of other stakeholders, is the way to maximize our well-being, and I use the word well-being and not use the word profits, then you have to zoom out and really ask yourself if that still works. And also, if people quit jobs, they don't quit for, let's say, their salaries. That's probably, I don't know, on the 10th in those ranks. They quit because they don't like the people, or they die, especially on the first place. There's the supervisor, so to say. That's why we also abolished it. So if you have horizontal approach and you have this kind of rotation principle that you work together as a team, then you don't have this problem anymore, to put it a little bit bluntly.
Yeah. I mean, the clue there is in the question: how do you drive people, right? Well, that assumes that people need driving, right? So we're back to trust. If you trust people, then you're not going to be asking yourself that question. Just one quick anecdote from another company called a happiness company in the UK. And one of the things that he did when he needed to drive up sales in a particular part of the company, the only thing he asked the sales team to do was just to put on the walls around their area their sales. That was all. He just said, be visible. no bonuses, no targets, nothing. But just by doing that, it meant that people then picked up the baton themselves to think about, well, okay, well, how could we improve these numbers? And then the second part of this question: what if objectives are not reached and the survival of the company is at stake? So what happens when objectives aren't reached? They're busy.
Just take away this approach of a certain goal. So I can give you a Zen answer. It's not the goal, but the road to be traveled. But I can also give you, let's say, a more practical approach to this. It's an infinite game. It's not a finite game. So for those people who are into books, just Google infinite game, Simon Sinek. But he didn't invent it. So it's about the journey. So if you're more into a spiritual approach, which I'm not a spiritual person. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm building a company, but it's always about a sense of purpose. It's doing something together. It's about liking what you're doing. So somebody asked if it's about happiness. That would be interesting. I did a podcast, an interview for Management 3.0, and I don't like the word happy, because there's also, again, this American connotation. Life is not about being happy. Life is about fulfillment. So achieving something together, and that's this kind of sense of purpose. And if you talk about metrics, etc., Richard just referred to it. What is a metrics? What is the metrics of your life? What kind of metrics did you decide to raise your children? What kind of metrics do you have in your partnership, or with your friends, or with your family? So we take this kind of managing the company. Manage comes from telling the horses what to do. We have to zoom out, and we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? What kind of madness are we creating, and why don't we just treat people like we treat our children or our friends? Why do we behave in such a different way when we enter a company?
Right, right. Yeah, that's great. And then we've got another question. So I think we've covered off the metrics and the happiness question there. What about books that you recommend to take to dig deep on the topic?
I would recommend a very famous podcast, or a podcast which will be hopefully very famous, but not because it's about being famous, but it's about inspiring. No, it's just to make a joke, and that's why Richard are laughing. Richard and I started a kind of project, and this podcast will be titled "You Should Read This," or somebody has a better idea. Then we're looking forward to this, and we discuss this kind of books. But it depends on the question. So if people are interested in let's say what I read, I read a lot. I read more or less a book a week, but Richard does as well. And then it just depends on the topic. So if you are interested in self-management, Google, let's say Richard's name or my name, and you will find stuff. If it's about purpose, you probably should dive much more into philosophy. If it's about rules in the company, we did a lot on the golden rule. I think Richard and I also did a talk on that. So it really depends on the topic, because this library is endlessly. It's also infinite, and I think it's always your own road. So search for yourself, search for your own answers.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer, and it comes back to trust. I mean, we can't trust others until we can trust ourselves, and trust yourself to your own intuition. Right, trust your own intuition. It starts there, and the right book will emerge at the right moment. Having said that, one book I loved that kicked me off on this journey was Maverick, which was by a guy called Ricardo Semler, and he turned around a company in Brazil with stunning effects. So that might be one. Where do you start the change if you want a happier company?
Ask your people. So it's just, but it's like a normal life. I mean, normally a conversation should be a conversation is no conversation if it's a vertical one and somebody tells at the top what people have to do. So
yeah.
So I think it always starts with a conversation. So just take a very simple example to refer also to this great place to work. We ask our people, what do we have to do next if we would like to have you in the company for the next 30 years? What's important for you?
Yeah.
So that's a totally different way of seeing things. I mean, you can also say, okay, let's put a display and let's talk about the sales of next week. But we like to zoom out and say, okay, we want to work together in a kind of we create our own ecosystem. We don't care about what others do. We don't care about competitors. We don't care about the whole sector. The financial sector is a mess. We just create our own environment, our own community, and we decide with each other how we do things. We have fixed salaries. We don't have bonuses. Everybody can choose the roles. Teams can hire their own colleagues, etc. We don't care what others think, which is right or wrong. So I think just try to find out together, and then start somewhere, and then it makes sense to start, let's say, more with a kind of fundament and the purpose, because that's something which keeps people together, especially in bad times. If everything is let's say evolving brilliantly, then it's easy. I always take this example of sailing. If the weather is nice, there are a lot of good sailors around. But if there's a thunderstorm, you can see who's still able to sail a boat.
Right. And a lot of people reflect on that during the pandemic, because this has exposed a lot of weak leaders or bad leaders, with this situation. Another good example of that, I'm just asking the people, is David Marquette and Turn the Ship Around, where
Yeah.
One of the first things he started with just taking the middle-ranking officers and asked them what impediments they had to doing their job, and that kicked off an entire cultural change. Ask the people.
Although I have to, let's say, also say that, let's say, if you just take an example, if you would be the CEO of the company, or if you would own the company, it still makes a lot of sense to read a lot, because some topics are really counterintuitive. So if you think about salary models, then it really makes sense to read research on that, to be able to argue and to understand that bonuses are counterproductive. And why are they counterproductive? It's not that complicated, and you don't have to be a university professor. It's very clear that if you have a common goal, it doesn't really help to say we have 10 people and at the end of the year 3 of them get a bonus and 7 not. So this demotivational aspect of those who will not be able to have a bonus in the end is worse than those who you think, and I really want to express, to think are the more important player. So it's about a kind of equality. Everybody is important, and perhaps we should have a kind of modesty that we perhaps don't know who is more important, or wouldn't even allow the question to be asked. And if you have read books like, for instance, Everybody Matters of Bob Chapman, an American entrepreneur who also buys companies, and he never fires people. He says everybody is important in this company. Everybody matters. So that goes much deeper. So if you have for yourself a kind of idea which road you want to travel, then it makes sense to be prepared for those discussions. And I have to admit that let's say people who really have read a lot of books often refer to a lot of research, which is very healthy for let's say discussions in companies.
Yeah. We've got another question here from Andrea. In an IT company where there are many different teams with different scopes, how to help managers to align objectives and constraints?
No, that's let's say follow the discussion. I mean, you can search for examples. Atlassian is a good example, Australian company in this field. So especially IT companies are doing pretty well. But it's also, let's say, what is your starting point? So when the starting point is trust, then you don't end up with command and control. If the starting point is distrust, you end up with command and control. If your starting point is everybody matters and everybody is equally important and it's always about team, so it's not about this exceptional person who decides or exceptional leadership. It's not the brilliant CEO, but dive into the research, because if you have not solved this question for yourself and you really think that the one brilliant guy, often the brilliant white 50-year-old CEO, is the reason why a company is doing well, yeah, then it will be very difficult to change your culture. So difficult.
Yeah, and of course, if you start with trust, you're immediately going to start asking the people themselves, right, and look in those areas for the answers. Yeah.
And just to take one example from Brooks, for instance, about trust. People who really have an embedded understanding of trust, they don't change their attitudes when something happens. So just take a very simple example. It's a book of Hewlett Packard, the Hewlett Packard way. Just to take one example, there are much more. And then I don't know if it was Packard or Hewlett who went into a factory, and he sees that all all the people, all the stuff people are using is behind, is locked, and it just takes off all the locks. And he says, why should you put locks on this let's say cupboards, etc. Yeah, people could steal this stuff. And I said that's the wrong starting point. So so it's always the question, what are the means, and what's the cause, or what's the basic principle. So you're not, if let's say something goes wrong in society, you don't want mass surveillance. So there's always a kind of question, what kind of culture do you want to create, and or also what kind of bureaucracy you want to create. That is in this famous example of Netflix, that people control all these travel expenses, etc. And they said, okay, it doesn't make sense. You have an enormous amount of bureaucracy. For what? For those 1% of people who sometimes, let's say, put an extra taxi bill on the expense sheet, etc. And then they solved it by putting all those travel expenses transparently somewhere in the company, so people could, if they are really interested, could dive into this stuff. But if you do this on a very small level and keep things simple and small, so if you would have a kind of transparency in the team about travel expenses, you don't have to control those people, because people will just behave correctly because they are behaving towards each other as colleagues in the team.
Yeah. Another question here: is self-organized always a good idea? You know, when we think of creative companies versus process-led companies.
Yes, it is. And I mean, I often got this question, and in the beginning, I thought I should answer with examples like buurtzorg, etc. But if you are in a very masculine, let's say, a command and control management conference setting, that's not the good example for them. So what I like to refer to is the army. And the funny thing is that in the army, so if you really talk about, let's say, our whole understanding of command and control, and somebody has to say what we have to do, especially in times of crisis, you find out, if you dive into this topic, that for instance, the German army, which I'm Dutch, I'm not German, in the German army, where we have a kind of understanding that it was totally vertical, had an enormous amount of self-organizing autonomy, and was let's say successful between brackets, because it's an awful topic. But the Americans just did a lot of research on that, and those extreme battlefield groups, they are extremely self-organizing, which Simon Sinek describes in his book Why Leaders Eat Last. So I would say, in the end, it always is, but the road which has to be traveled to reach that goal can be a very, very long one.
Right. Yeah. And the other example I love in the States is Morning Star, which is a tomato processing company. It does get much more process-led than processing tomatoes. So yeah, I think it can always be done.
Turning the ship around is about submarines, so it's also not about a non-profit setting.
Yeah. So we've sort of covered the bonus questions here. Can you elaborate more on how you hire people and what is important for you in this process?
Oh, it's very simple, decentralized. So people in the team, let's just take an example, very practical one. We have a credit department, 7 or 8 people. They want to hire a new colleague because they have too much work to do. Our people first, or I mean, we hate the word HR, because people are not resources, facilitates the process, and then in the team, the one who is in charge at that moment, is rotation leadership. So the one who is in that moment will ask their colleagues who wants to do a talk let's say with the new hire, or wants to be involved in this process, and everybody has a veto, and those people decide themselves for themselves who they want to hire. And then what's the logic behind it? They feel responsible, so they will take a common decision. They will think, oh, Richard will be an amazing hire for our team. And then perhaps they find out, because that's always the question, how do you solve it when Richard is not an excellent hire? The starting point will be that everybody feels responsible to make Richard a very successful colleague. And then when they find out that, let's say, it seldom happens, the new colleague was a mishire, so to say, then also those people will find out together. And often if you would have a kind of underperformance, there is a reason for that. So in the end, it's about intrinsic motivation. So if you are in this whole structure, if somebody is not successful and people decide in the team themselves based on strength of the individual who is taking care of what role or what responsibility, then in the end, it's intrinsic motivation which is lacking. And if intrinsic motivation is lacking, we always say, search as long as possible until you find something which gives you fulfillment, and then you are back to a sense of purpose.
Right. What would you recommend to old-fashioned managers, like command and control mindset, on how to evolve their own mindset to establish trust? That's from Fabian.
Oh, that's a very good question. That's very difficult to answer because it depends very much on the setting of the company, but also on the setting of the person itself. So it's very difficult. Just take one example. If you have a, let's say, stock listed company, and which is dominated by short-term interest of shareholders who have the shares for 3 months, it's very difficult to escape this kind of rationale. So and then you can have a kind of schizophrenic situation that if people would be very honest to themselves, they would admit to themselves that they don't have autonomy. They even don't like it, but they are in a kind of system on the one hand where perhaps they have to admit to themselves that that's the case, or they don't care. That's also possible, but then there's this self-reflection missing, or people in the end quit and search for a new environment. So Frédéric Laloux says in his book, with his experience as a consultant, but also others do, that there can be settings which are extremely difficult to change. And then the question is an individual one. Do you want to be Don Quixote? Sometimes it could, for instance, also be interesting to read more this kind of literature. Do you want to be a Don Quixote and fight against the windmills?
Sorry, a donkey shot. What's that?
Don Quixote is the Spanish literature of the guy who's fighting the windmills. So I don't know. I don't know if
Don
there is
Quixote. Okay, yeah.
Don Quixote. Okay, Don Quixote. My Spanish.
You might be pronouncing it correctly.
No. My Spanish is non-existent. So, and I actually don't know how you pronounce it in English. But so the question is just, do you want to fight a fight which you can't win, or let's say, do you do something else? So, just take a very actual example. If you work for an oil company at the moment, and you watch, let's say, the whole discussion about climate change, it's a very good question. Will you be able to change something internally? I don't have the answer.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's hard. I mean, in Gary Hamel's latest book, Humanocracy, one of the concepts he introduces, which I like, is this idea of the recovering bureaucrat, right? And if we're in these command and control bureaucracies, one of the first steps to get out of them is it's a bit like being an alcoholic, right? The first step is to admit we're an alcoholic. Like the first step is to admit we're a kind of command and control bureaucrat. And if you can find groups that can do that collectively, from there may be an opening to change.
I just wanted to, because I see a question which often comes about underperformance in teams.
Yeah.
I think we also should take this as an example, because you often have this kind of reaction. Yeah, that sounds very nice, and when you always would have only outperformance. I understand that self-organization works pretty well, but how do you deal with underperforming? So the question is always, what is underperformance? And there are three ways in how to answer this. One we already answered. It's about intrinsic motivation. So when the starting point is that everybody is intrinsically motivated, and you have a situation in the team where people are able themselves to decide together who is taking care of what, there's enormous acceptance for taking different parts of what has to be done. And there's an enormous acceptance that everything is equally important. And I just want to take a very practical example. So one half of the company are mortgage advisors. And mortgage advisors, there are different type of mortgage advisors. So they're mortgage advisors, they like much more talking to clients. There are, let's say, the classical mortgage advisor, who's perhaps a little bit more extrovert, or is seen as the typical mortgage advisor, is different from the more introvert person. And then you have, but everybody knows that also, let's say, a database has to be actual, or you have to care about content, or explaining in videos on your website, let's say, how do you approach the whole topic, let's say for clients, etc. And if you have the same salary, and you don't have a bonus on the revenue or on your own revenue, then everybody in the end is very happy that everybody can go after the topic people like themselves most. So there are, let's say, colleagues who say, I love to talk to clients all the time. I hate to onboard new colleagues. I hate to update the database. I don't like to do videos at all. And because we have, our approach is that's always about cultural fit. We have, for instance, a former teacher who teaches Latin and Greek, and she does all the videos, because our filmer says it's only one shot with Annelieke. Why? Because she was in front of the class, and she is really well equipped, and let's say she has studied this kind of how do you teach. So she is very well able to explain in a simple way, so to say, let's say in clients' videos, where it is all about, and our filmer loves her, because he always needs one shot.
Fantastic. Yeah. Good. Well, we've got 8 minutes left. Do we have time for one more? I know we want to do a closing poll. I'm not hearing a no, so let's.
Yes, so you do.
Yeah.
You can. We can keep going till maybe 5 to, and then we can wrap up. So we've got a few minutes.
Okay, sure. Okay, so so the follow-up question from Fabian is, so how to change the system? What might be the message to change hierarchically structured system? Do we need the leaders to change in the first instance?
Yeah, I want to end with a more philosophical remark. Also, because if people are interested, you can Google a lot of talks also between Richard and me on all those topics. There are a lot of videos around. I just want to end with a philosophical remark. Heidegger once said, we should walk more often, do walks on the graveyard. So in the end, it's always about self-reflection. It's always about memento mori. It's so, especially the more
remember death.
Yeah, remember that. The Latin. Yeah. So it's always about self-reflection. And if you don't have any self-reflection, and if you are egoistic, and you don't care about others, then it's a very difficult discussion. But let's consider that in the end, people have a kind of self-reflection. and there are a lot of ways to do this. Heidegger this is one example, but you can also say, okay, when I would die, and we did a pretty extensive talk on that. Remember, you will die, I think, is the title of our conversation. It's about self-reflection, and I think the bigger the problems are, the more you have to zoom out. If you want to change climate change, it's about the question: do you have children or grandchildren yourself? If you really want to zoom out, it's not about diving into carbon emission certificates, etc. So zoom out, ask the more philosophical questions, and that's probably the best starting point.
Right, and there's some good evidence for that. I was reading a book called The Future of Capitalism by Paul Collier, and in there's some research, and they asked people, what do they regret most? Is it not getting the things they wanted, or not having done the things they felt they ought to have done? And people regret much more not having done the things they ought to have done. So dwelling in that question of like, what ought I be doing now, given I will die, is a very powerful one. As you say, of many we can ask, but it's the point of self-reflection.
Self-management in the end is for those who manage the biggest relief, because your own life is much more fulfilling. So it creates an enormous amount of stress for those people in a vertical organization. So that's an aspect we don't often talk about. Perhaps something for another session, especially if you talk about top managers. In the end, they are not happy. And
nor are their kids, right? That the children of high-level executives are more likely to become addicts and have mental health problems.
So just that's something I wanted to add, because that's something, perhaps if you have a very trustful relation to somebody on the top on this vertical organizations, then that also could be a topic to dive into. Are you really happy in the way you are at this top and have an enormous, let's say from outside, enormous, you're famous or important, but those people in the end are not happy?